Well, we're back talking finance again today, and what happens in our personal finances, our family finances, even our business finances. Gavin Martin, the founder of Cornerstone Wealth, is back with us to talk all issues finance, and today our focus on having a will in place. Gavin Martin, welcome back to 2020.
Oh, g'day Neil, great to be with you.
Gavin, when we talk about wills, this is obviously a safety net for our family if something is to go wrong. And if we've got children, perhaps a husband and wife raising children, if one of those were to die, then obviously the whole family is thrown into turmoil. So having a will obviously is a wise thing, not just something that's a luxury.
Yeah, having a will is really important, but often it gets put into the not urgent box, and so it doesn't get done. But it is very important to have a will in place for a range of reasons, and it's important for families, but it's also important for singles as well, because often there's more subjectiveness about where assets should go in the event of death when you are single.
And Gavin, dying without a will, that has ramifications too for the single person and also for the family.
Yeah, it does. So the rules around how it is dealt with, your assets are dealt with in the event of death if you don't have a will, and it's called dying interstate, and there are state-based rules about how that is administered. And so if you don't have a will, it's basically the state's rules that will dictate where your assets go. And just a quick example of how it can have a really negative impact. If you take an example of John and Mary, they're a married couple on the age pension, for example. They've got a home worth $500,000 and they've got $50,000 in the bank. So they're largely living off the age pension. Now, if John was to die, for example, and turned out that the home was held in his name, he bought the property before they were married, and then their bank account was also in his name. So they've got $550,000 worth of assets, but in this scenario, because John didn't have a will, the state determines where the money goes. And in Victoria, I know the rules are different all over Australia depending on your state, but in this particular scenario, what would happen is that $100,000 of the $550,000 of assets would go to Mary, the wife, and then they have 3 adult children, and so the remaining amount is split between the rest of the children, and Mary as well. So what can happen is that Mary can end up with $250,000, and each of the adult children can end up with $300,000, so $100,000 each. And so what that would mean is that if the children weren't supportive of the mother, that then Mary would need to move out of the home and potentially not have enough resources to live on. Obviously, in most cases, the children would be supportive and help mum through that, but it just illustrates how not having a will can really be detrimental to your circumstances.
And it's one of those things that many of our listeners, and you've probably seen this sort of thing too, Gavin, where families can be torn apart because there is no will. You get families fighting each other in the courts over the deceased estate, and that really is a tragedy, isn't it?
Yes, having a will in place is really important, but if you want to make sure that you're not going to cause issues after your death, even when you do have a will in place, it's good to communicate why you are making certain decisions, because you can love your children equally but treat them differently. So you might have a child with higher needs and give them more money, and that's fine to put that in the will, but it's also good to be able to communicate that as well and say the reasons why you're doing that, and so that there is no long-term issue between siblings that's caused by that sort of decision.
I guess updating the will regularly is going to be an important part of that as well, because if you have a will when your eldest children are little, and then you have more children, it's good to have them named in the will.
Yeah, exactly. I don't know the full legalities of just saying split equally between all my children or naming them specifically, but if you have more children or you get married or there's a death, it's well worthwhile reviewing your will and generally we say every 3 to 5 years, if there's no change in your circumstances, just review your will to make sure that it is up to date.
So Gavin, you can talk about a will with your financial advisor, but ultimately you might end up talking to your lawyer or the public trustee, someone who specifically deals with this specialised form of getting a will in place. But really it's not a difficult process, is it?
No, you can go down the track of setting up wills yourself as well, so you can get kits and set them up, but it isn't always watertight when you do it yourself, so I encourage people to go to a lawyer to get it done. I have a friend who's a lawyer, and his sister actually went out and did a will kit and put the will together and then showed it to her lawyer brother, and in that process he worked out that what her intentions weren't reflected in that will that she did via a will kit. So it can actually problematic if you don't get it established appropriately.
And Gavin, how old before you think about getting a will seriously? I guess it's once you start to accumulate some personal assets. Is that the case? Yes,
it is important to consider as your assets increase. But one thing that you need to factor in, even a young person, in their teens or early 20s, if they have a job and a superannuation fund associated with that, often the default level of cover in their superannuation fund can be hundreds of thousands of dollars. So even if you don't have much assets in terms of you don't own a home, you've got a small amount of cash in the bank, or you might own a car and that's it, you might think, well, I don't really need a will, it's not really much in terms of assets. But if you've got a superannuation account with insurance, it could mean that you've got a couple of $100,000 that needs to be distributed on the event of your death.
Just because you have a job, you might be a whole lot richer than you thought.
Exactly.
Gavin, from the Christian perspective, the idea, and some will look at a biblical foundation of the ideal of leaving an inheritance for your children. This is a way, isn't it, to ensure that the inheritance that you leave is legally in place so that your children will benefit from your estate.
Yes, exactly. I think there's that scripture about leaving an inheritance to your children and your grandchildren, and that can be done in the form of financial things, but I guess it is also really reflecting passing on the faith to each generation as well. Yes, and there's lots of elements and lots of dimensions to leaving an inheritance to our children and to our grandchildren too. Gavin Martin, good talking to you about wills, and we should say that information that we share isn't necessarily a personal financial advice that's coming from Gavin, so for advice that does relate to your personal circumstances, you should talk to your financial advisor, or in this case, it might be a lawyer. Gavin Martin from Cornerstone Wealth. I'll point people to your website, Gavin, www.cornerstonewealth.com.au. Gavin, it's always a pleasure. Thanks for being with us again today on 2020. Thank you, Neil. Great to be with you.